The first sign was not the voices, but the silence that cut through them. The restaurant had been alive a moment before. Forks against porcelain, glasses filled with amber light, conversations rising and falling like gentle tides. Then a shift came, so small most missed it. A lull in laughter, a sudden stiffness in the air, as if the whole place had sucked in a breath and forgotten to let it out. James Whitaker noticed. He always noticed. From his place by the service station, he saw 3 men pressing to the crowd with a predator's certainty. Their shoulders carve a path that no one dared block, their boots sounding too heavy for a place that prided itself on velvet quiet. They were not here to dine. They were here for her. At the high table in the back, Eileen Ashford sat with the grace of someone accustomed to being observed, though she never asked for it. A glass of wine in hand, she listened to a board member drone through numbers, her eyes distant, cool, and tired. She did not see the men closing in, but James did. He set down the tray in his hands without sound. His gaze swept once to the corner booth where Viola Whitaker, his 8-year-old daughter, sat cross-legged with crayons scattered like jewels across her paper placemat. She was bent over a drawing, lip caught between her teeth, utterly absorbed. For a moment, James felt the knife edge of choice: stay by her side or move toward the storm. The decision was no decision at all. He slipped through the crowd, body angled, steps measured. His waiter's vest blended him into the background, but his eyes stayed fixed on the intruders as they advanced on a high table. He knew their kind, the cocky roll of their shoulders, the surety that fear alone would clear the way. He had seen it in alleys overseas, in men who thought violence was simply another tool. Ms. Ashford. The first man's voice carried sharp enough to silence the clink of cutlery. He was tall, angular, his jaw cut like stone beneath the glow of the chandelier. His companions flanked him, one thick through the chest, the other wiry and restless, eyes darting as if he already anticipated the fight to come. Eileen looked up unbothered at first. She had lived too long in rooms where men thought intimidation was power. "This is a private dinner," she said, voice cool, almost bored. The angular one leaned in, his smile slick. "Not anymore. You'll leave the company. Tonight, you'll sign what needs signing," or his hand pressed flat on the table, his rings catching the light. "This pretty restaurant becomes a memory." Chairs scraped. Other guests shrank back. None moved to help. The staff froze in place. James had reached them now. He placed himself just behind the men, invisible for a breath, the calm before thunder. His jaw tightened, the old rhythm returning. Scanning exits, mapping angles, calculating distances between breath and violence. Eileen still hadn't seen him. Her attention locked on the man across from her, though the faintest tremor in her hand betrayed her composure. Her past was full of men who betrayed, who threatened. She had learned not to flinch. The angular man's hand shifted toward her wrist. That was the moment James moved. A step forward, smooth as a tide rolling in, his hand catching the man's wrist mid-reach. A twist, quick and merciless. The man let out a hiss of pain as James slammed his arm down on the table, the wine glasses toppling, red spilling like blood across white cloth. For an instant the restaurant held its breath. Then it broke apart. The thick-set man lunged first, shoving his chair aside. James pivoted, catching the motion in peripheral vision. His fist drove once, clean into the man's ribs, then again into his jaw. The sound cracked through the restaurant louder than applause. The man staggered back, clutching aside. The wiry one pulled a blade from his jacket. Too quick, too careless. James was quicker. He grabbed a chair by the back and swung, the wood splintering as it caught the blade hand, and sent the man sprawling into another table. Plates shattered. Screams rose. Through it all, James's face remained carved from stone, his breaths even measured. Violence was not performance. It was precision. It was survival. The angular man had recovered, rage twisting his features. He swung wildly. James ducked, brought his elbow up hard beneath the man's chin, and felt bone give beneath the impact. The man crumpled to ground, gasping like a fish hauled from water. And then silence. Shards of glass glittered across the floor. Wine bled across linens. The men groaned where they fell, stripped of their swagger. James straightened slowly, scanning the room, instinct still crackling. No more threats. Just wide-eyed faces staring at him. Waiters, patrons, board members, all struck dumb by the quiet storm they had just witnessed. At last, his gaze fell on Eileen Ashford. Her chair remained upright, her composure mostly intact, but her eyes, green, sharp, unblinking, were fixed on him. Something flickered there, something James couldn't quite name. Shock, yes. Gratitude, maybe. But deeper than that, a recognition. For the first time in years, someone had stood for her with no profit to gain. Behind him, a voice pierced the stillness. Daddy! Viola! She had abandoned her crayons and now rushed through the forest of broken chairs, her little boots clattering against marble. She collided into James's side, arms wrapping tight around him. He crouched at once, gathering her close, pressing his forehead briefly to her hair. Her presence steadied him more than air in his lungs. Eileen watched the tenderness, the way this scarred man softened utterly at the weight of a child in his arms. Her throat tightened against her will. The police came eventually. Statements were made. The three men dragged out in cuffs and curses. The restaurant emptied, guests spilling into night eager to forget. But Eileen remained at her table, glass unbroken now in her grip, staring into shadows. James, coat half off as he guided Viola into it, turned to leave. You didn't have to do that. Eileen's voice stopped him. He looked back. His eyes, dark hazel flecked with something that had seen too much, met hers. Yes, I did. No swagger. No explanation. Just truth. She held his gaze a long moment, then glanced down. The faintest tremor moved through her hand as she reached for her purse, as though unused and not being in control. Viola, still holding her father's hand, stepped forward shyly. She held something out toward Eileen, a small, folded crane, crayon-colored, creased unevenly, but beautiful in the way children's offerings are beautiful. Eileen blinked. Slowly, she reached out. Her hand brushed Viola's as she accepted it. The paper was warm from the girl's palm. Thank you, Eileen whispered. Her voice was softer than she meant, almost fragile. Viola smiled, the kind of smile that gave without asking. James squeezed her hand gently, pride flickering through his otherwise impassive face. For reasons she could not explain, Eileen tucked the paper crane into her clutch. She told herself it was nothing, just a child's toy. But when she felt its edges against her palm, she knew she would not let it go. Outside, the night air bit cold. James lifted Viola into his arms, carrying her against his chest as if nothing else mattered. And for the first time in years, Eileen Ashford wished she had someone like that walking her into the night. The restaurant had been scrubbed back to silence by the time they stepped outside. Police lights washed the street in red and blue, sirens fading into distance. Inside, staff hurried to sweep glass and restore the illusion of calm, but the air still carried the taste of fear. James Whitaker adjusted his daughter's coat around her shoulders, crouching so the zipper would not snag against her chin. It was habit more than thought, these small rituals of care that steadied his life. Viola's crayons rattled softly in her coat pocket as she leaned into him. Across the empty lobby, Eileen Ashford stood alone. The high table was gone, the board members long since scattered. She had been left behind with the taste of betrayal still bitter on her tongue. That was always the way, wasn't it? When danger pressed close, loyalty evaporated like morning frost. James turned to leave. Wait! Her voice cut the stillness like glass. He stopped, glancing over his shoulder. Viola blinked between them, small hand curled in his. You saved my life tonight. Eileen's heels clicked softly against marble as she crossed the distance. Her face was composed, as always, but her eyes betrayed the tremor beneath. I need to thank you properly. James shook his head. No need. His voice was low, steady. He had never liked gratitude. It made the act feel like transaction. He hadn't fought for her sake alone. He had fought because he could not stand still. Eileen's mouth curved, not quite into a smile. You risked everything in a room where no one else even stood up. Before James could answer, Viola tugged free from his hand. She rummaged in her pocket and drew out another crumpled piece of paper, one of her cranes. The folds were uneven, the wings bent, but her little hand smoothed them flat before she offered it up. "This is for you," she said, her voice small but certain. Eileen looked down at the child, startled by the simple courage of the gesture. She took the paper crane carefully, as though it were made of glass. The edges were softened by warm fingers, colored with streaks of crayon and uneven blues and yellows. Something in her chest shifted. She hadn't been offered a gift with no strings attached in years. "Thank you, Viola." Eileen's voice softened around the name. James rested a hand lightly on his daughter's shoulder. "We should go." But Eileen stopped him again. "Mr. Whitaker? James." Her voice dropped lower, more private. "This wasn't a random attack. I know who sent them. And I can't trust the people who are supposed to protect me anymore." He frowned, wary. "Then you should call in someone you can trust." "That's what I'm doing." Her green eyes held his, sharp but trembling at the edges. "I want you." The words hung in the air. James felt Viola shift closer against his side, her small hand clinging tighter. He exhaled slowly. "Ma'am, I'm a waiter. I keep plates steady. That's all." Her lips parted, then pressed shut. The lie of his modesty was obvious after what she'd seen. But she did not push. She only inclined her head, the faintest bow of someone unaccustomed to asking twice. "Think about it," she said. 2 nights later, James was at her side. He had not told Viola the full truth, only that he would be helping a woman who had no one else. His daughter accepted it with the matter-of-factness of children who trusted without question. When James drove her to school the next morning, she had asked whether Miss Ashford would be okay. He had promised yes. And so he found himself standing in a glass tower lobby, the city stretching vast and cold through windows high above. He fell out of place in his plain jacket, but Eileen did not treat him like an intruder. She introduced him not as a waiter, but simply, "This is James Whitaker. He's with me." Her tone brooked no question. The board members nodded, wary but silent. They saw the scar by his brow, the set of his shoulders, the watchfulness in his gaze, and they knew better than to argue. Viola's paper crane sat discreetly at the edge of Eileen's desk, half hidden beneath a stack of documents. James noticed it, though he said nothing. The days that followed wove strange new rhythms. At first, James kept the shadows, a presence at Eileen's side during long meetings, his eyes always on doors, his instincts coiled. He barely spoke. She barely looked at him. But silence has a way of softening over time. He began to fix things, small unnoticed tasks. A loose lock on her office door, a flickering light in the garage. He moved with quiet efficiency, acts of service done not for recognition, but because the world worked better when little things held. She watched him once, repairing the latch with a borrowed screwdriver. His jacket hung open, shirt sleeves rolled, forearms corded with work. He said nothing, did not notice her gaze. For reasons she could not name, her breath caught, and Viola's presence threaded through it all. Some evenings, when school let out late, she would join them. She filled the cold spaces of the office with laughter, coloring at Eileen's table while her father stood guard. One evening, Viola shyly offered Eileen a drawing. 3 figures, hand in hand, beneath a bright yellow sun. Eileen stared at it longer than she meant to. "Who's this?" she asked softly. "That's you," Viola said simply. For a moment, Eileen had to look away. At night, alone in her penthouse, Eileen would unfold the paper crane, smoothing its wings flat before folding them again. She told herself it was foolish, sentimental, yet her fingers lingered on the creases, as though they were the map of a life she had never allowed herself to hope for. She thought of James's eyes in the restaurant, unflinching. She thought of Viola's hand pressing warmth into her palm. And she whispered into the dark, a confession no one would hear. "I haven't trusted anyone in years." The city lights blinked back at her like 1,000 indifferent witnesses. By the 3rd week, trust had taken shape in small, unspoken ways. James began driving her himself, unwilling to leave her in company cars that might be compromised. He spoke little on the road, but his presence filled the silence with steadiness. She would steal glances at him sometimes, catching the faint lines at the corner of his eyes, the scar at his brow. She wondered what it had cost him to carry such quiet, And slowly, Eileen found her shoulders easing when he was near. She had built her world on vigilance. But with James Whitaker at her side, she found moments where she could breathe, moments where she felt almost safe. The first time she realized how much she had come to rely on him was during a storm-swept evening. Rain lashed against glass, thunder rattling the high windows of her office. The board had scattered earlier, leaving her alone with James in the dim-lit conference room. Lightning flashed, illuminating the city below in stark white. "You should go home," she told him, her voice softer than usual. He shook his head. "Not until you're safe." For an instant, their eyes held. Something shifted between them, not spoken, not acknowledged, but undeniable. Eileen looked away, her pulse quickening in a way she hadn't felt in years. She reached for her purse to steady her hands, but her fingers brushed instead against a folded crane inside. It reminded her of Viola's voice, small and sure. "This is for you." Perhaps, she thought, trust was not something lost forever. Perhaps it could be given again, in paper folds and steady hands. The invitation came on a day that smelled like rain. Eileen Ashford sent it without preface. Dinner at her home. Nothing formal, just a meal. The message was brief, almost careful, like someone setting a fragile glass on a table and stepping back to see if it holds. James read it twice, thumb brushing cracked face of his old Navy watch, while Viola tugged at his sleeve and asked what semi-formal meant. He told her it meant clean sweater, neat hair, crayons allowed. The elevator whispered them up to a floor of sky. Eileen's penthouse open in hushing glass, the city thrown like a galaxy beneath her windows. Viola pressed her hands to the glass and breathed a little wow, while James took in the black marble entryway, the soft lamplight, the bowl on a low console that held, impossibly, a small paper crane nestled among keys and a silver pen. "She kept it," Viola whispered, half to herself. Eileen was there in the doorway of the living room, bare feet, sleeves rolled, a softness he'd never seen on her face. For a moment, all the room she had ever commanded melted into something smaller and truer. She glanced at the bowl, caught his eye, and then looked away, color touching her throat. "I hope you're hungry," she said. "I made too much." "You cooked?" James asked, more startled than he meant to be. A tiny smile. "I can follow instructions." "Mostly." Dinner was roast chicken, lemon, and rosemary, the kind of food that fills a home with warmth. Viola swung her feet and told Eileen about a school art project, how she glued tiny shells into a shape that was supposed to be a star, but turned out like a flower, how the glue left her fingers shiny. Eileen listened as if the world depended on it. Her board had talked to her for years. This small girl talked to her, the difference a kind of grace she hadn't known she starved for. James watched the way Eileen's attention settled, not like a searchlight, but like lamplight, warm and steady. He ate slowly, measuring perimeter in quiet habit. The shadowed corner by the balcony doors, the blind spots between marble pillars, the reflection on a window that gave a second view of the room. His hand moved periodically to the watch at his wrist, an old ritual that made sense only to him. After dinner, Viola yawned like a cat and tried to hide it. Eileen pointed her gently toward the guest room she'd made up with fresh sheets and a silly pillow shaped like a cloud. There were colored pencils on the bedside table, a glass of water, a small dish for treasures. Viola hesitated, looked up at her father. James nodded. She went, then paused, running back to hug Eileen with sudden, fierce certainty, as children do once they've decided. Eileen froze, then wrapped her arms around the narrow back with a care that made her eyes sting. When Viola's door clicked shut, the penthouse fell into a softer quiet. Lamps, not overhead lights. The city a field of fireflies. On a low table sat a folder thick with documents. On top of it, unassuming as a feather, the second paper crane. Eileen reached for it and turned it in her fingers. "I kept it near me at the office," she said, not looking at him. It felt unprofessional, but it made me breathe. "You don't owe anyone performance of being made of stone," James said. "That's funny," she murmured, "because I built an entire life on it." She looked up then, and something in her gaze had shifted, less steel, more human ache. "James, I need to ask you something I wish I didn't have to ask. He straightened, every sense sharpening without moving a muscle. I have reason to believe someone close to me, very close, has been compromised. The words tasted like ash. My head of security. We met 10 years ago. He carried boxes when I moved offices. He sent flowers when my engagement collapsed. He told me I was safe. She swallowed. I think he's been selling me piece by piece. Silence held. James could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint whisper of air through vents, the low traffic miles below. He did not say I knew it, though he had suspected. He did not say, I told you so. He asked simply, why tell me now? Because you bring your daughter to my office and check the shadows before you check your phone. Because you fix the things no one else sees. Because you fight only when you must. And when you do, you make it quiet. Because I want to believe that what I saw in that restaurant was what it felt like. Someone who stands with no price attached. She said only. Because you're the one person whose loyalty isn't for sale. His mouth tightened. The old bruise of pride and poverty flared and settled. Then you should know, tonight won't be clean. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I know. He rose, walked the perimeter again, slower, more deliberate. He checked the front door lock, the balcony latches, the small camera embedded in a recessed ceiling corner, and frowned. The angle was wrong. Field of view widened too conveniently. He traced the wiring with his gaze to a hidden panel near the hallway, stepped close, listened. A faint new hum. A device spliced in, recent enough that dust hadn't settled. Someone else has keys, he said. The elevator dinged then, soft as a bell. Not theirs. Not expected. James turned all the lights off with one clean sweep. Darkness dropped like a curtain. He moved Eileen back with a hand to her elbow and positioned himself between her and the entryway. The penthouse breathed in shadow and city glow. From the guest room, a small shift of bedsheets. A child's sigh. James felt his pulse steady, not quicken. Calm built a cage around fear. A key slid into the lock. The door opened an inch, then 5. A silhouette filled the gap, then another, careful, moving without talk, the way practiced men do when they expect resistance. Not the head of security first. No, he wouldn't dirty himself with the first risk. He would send the two who took the money and believed it meant they were men. The first one crept in, weight forward, eyes adjusting. He didn't even get the chance to open his mouth. James moved, a shadow cutting through shadows, caught the wrist at reach and folded it backward until bone kissed bone. The small sound the intruder made was wet and shocked. The second lunge, knife low. James kicked the coffee table hard, sending it skittering into the man's shins. He folded over with a strangled grunt. In the brief arc of city light, steel flashed. James turned with a momentum and drove his shoulder into the first man's sternum, heard the thud, felt the air leave him. Lights. A voice hissed from the hall. Familiar, smooth wrong. Eileen's head tilted, hearing what James heard in that voice. 10 years of Christmas cards, and inside them a small, folded betrayal. Don't, James murmured, and she didn't. She moved instead, quiet and sure, into the hallway that led to Viola's room. He heard the whisper of the door, the click of the lock, the soft hush of a mother in a body that had never had the title, and yet found the motion perfectly. The head of security stepped in then, gun drawn low and smart, not theatrical. James could make out enough. The slope of the shoulder, the set of the jaw, the old familiarity in the way he scanned the room. He stopped just inside, tested the dark. You don't have to die for her, he said mildly. That's the difference between us. James answered. The man smiled, regret like a stain. She thinks loyalty is love. It's just a contract with worse terms. On the floor, the second intruder shifted, knife scraping on marble. The sound cost him. James stepped on the hand, heel pinning blade to stone. The man hissed, froze. What's the payout? James asked. It was not curiosity. It was stalling, measuring, mapping error, angles, fate. Enough to start again somewhere warm. The gun lifted a fraction. Step aside. James didn't. He moved again, not forward but sideways, toward the console table, the bowl, the crane, the pen. He took the bowl with his left hand and flung it. The silver pen pinged against the floor. The bowl crashed into the intruder's shin. The gun wavered, a breath, a hair's width. It was all he needed. He closed the distance in 3 steps, caught the wrist, slammed it against the doorframe. The shot, that fire went wide, shattering glass by the entryway. The head of security cursed, tried to twist free. James's grip was iron born of years on ships and in alleys where a wrong angle meant a coffin. He drove his forearm into the man's throat, not to crush, but to stop language. With his other hand, he bent the gun wrist until the weapon clattered free. The second intruder surged up, wild. Eileen was there before James could turn, a heavy glass candle holder in both hands. She swung once, not elegant, not precise, but with modern ferocity that made a dull, decisive sound. The man dropped, curl of breath leaving him. For a second, all 3 stood in the kind of silence people remember later as ringing. Then James wrenched the head of security's arm behind him, face to the wall, breath hot and ugly. "You let them in," Eileen said, voice so controlled it shook. "You stood in my home and let them in." "It's not personal," he rasped. "Then you never knew me," she said. Sirens again, closer. James bound the intruders with zip ties. He pulled from a drawer where he'd placed them days ago, a quiet insurance no one had noticed him tucking away. He dialed with steady hands, gave the address, the fax. He did not let himself feel anything but the shape of safety returning, piece by piece, to these rooms. When it was over, after uniforms and statements, after the elevator swallowed the men who'd come to break the night, Eileen closed the door with her palm flat against it and did not move. James turned then and truly saw her. The smudge of soot on her cheek where the gunpowder and broken glass had written in ash, the tremor at the corner of her mouth, the brightness in her eyes that was not from tears alone. "You okay?" he asked softly. "Yes," she lied, and then shook her head. "No." He nodded once. The guest room door opened a crack. A small face appeared, the braid crooked from sleep. "Daddy." "It's okay," James said, voice instantly warm. "It's over, Bug. Back to bed." Eileen sank onto the sofa as if someone had untied her ribs. James crouched near the coffee table, picked up the silver pen from the floor, set it quietly beside the paper crane that had somehow survived the fall. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline leaching out, leaving him cold. A thin line of blood tracked along his forearm where the knife had kissed skin. "Let me," Eileen said, surprising herself with the urgency of it. She crossed to a cabinet, returned with small first aid kit, knelt in front of him on the carpet. She cleaned the cut with careful, trembling hands, her breath snagging when he flinched, not from pain, but from the intimacy of being cared for. Her hair had fallen loose. A strand brushed his wrist. Neither moved to tuck it away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not for the wound. For the years she had mistaken watchmen for guardians. For the way trust had become a currency she kept locked and then forgot how to spend. For the sound of a child whispering in a room down the hall. Safe tonight because of a man she had almost not asked. "You don't have to be," he said. They sat like that, the city buzzing beneath them, the bandage white and neat, the paper crane a small, stubborn bright thing between the pen and the keys. James checked his watch, then covered it with his palm, holding still as if time itself needed quiet. "Stay," she said, before she could decide if she meant tonight or something larger. "Both of you. Just stay." He looked at her a long moment, the weight of the word turning in the air between them. He thought of the ways of life shifts, not in leaps, but in the accumulation of small, undeniable yes. He nodded. From down the hall, Viola called sleepily, "Is Miss Ashford okay?" Eileen closed her eyes and breathed and answered, voice steady, "I am now." And for the first time in years, the word felt true in her mouth. The apartment had changed. It wasn't the locks, though James had replaced them, layering new bolts with his steady, practical hands. It wasn't the cameras, though he walked the perimeter himself, installed angles that didn't lie, wires that no longer hummed deceit. It wasn't even the men in uniforms who came and went, taking reports, tightening ranks. No, the change was quieter, less visible. The rooms no longer carried the hollow echo of someone who lived alone. A child's laugh drifted down the hall now. A pair of small shoes sat by the door, one tipped sideways, laces untied. A drawing of 3 figures, stick arms joined beneath a yellow sun, was pinned by a magnet to the refrigerator, where once there had been only sterile glass bottles of mineral water. James Whitaker had not meant to bring these things here. He had told himself he was a soldier only for duty, a father only for Viola. But somehow, his daughter had carried warmth into Eileen Ashford's world as naturally as breath, and once there, it had rooted. One evening, weeks after the night of betrayal, Eileen stood at the balcony doors while rain streaked the glass. James was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, cleaning a cast-iron pan that seemed too ordinary for her gleaming counters. Viola sat cross-legged on the rug, humming to herself, crayons scattered like constellations. Eileen turned from the window, watching them both. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. James looked up, eyebrow raised. "The Navy," she clarified. "The structure, the certainty." He dried his hands on a towel, thoughtful. "I miss the men I serve with. The rituals, the way a ship feels alive under your feet." He paused. "But I don't miss the silence after. Coming home to nothing." Eileen's eyes lingered on him, then slid toward Viola. "Not nothing," she said softly. James's gaze followed hers. His daughter was bent over her drawing, tongue peeking out as she colored. He smiled, the kind of smile that softened the scar by his brow, the kind that belonged only to her. "No," he agreed quietly. "Not nothing." The paper crane never left Eileen's desk. Some days, during tense board meetings when voices sharpened and alliances cracked, she would touch it beneath the table, a talisman folded by small hands. It reminded her that strength was not found only in walls of glass and steel. Sometimes it was found in paper, in children's laughter, in the steady presence of a man who stood without asking what it might cost him. The board had been gutted and rebuilt, traitors excised. New faces came, loyal ones who believed not in profit alone, but in the woman who had built the empire brick by brick. And at her side, silent but immovable, stood James Whitaker. Not a shadow, not a guard, a presence. The whispers began, of course. Employees who noted the way her gaze found him across a room, the way his shoulders eased only when she was near. But she let them whisper, because for once, she did not live by their words. One night, Viola crept sleepily into the living room where James and Eileen sat in quiet conversation. She clutched her sketchbook to her chest, braid unraveling, eyes heavy with dreams. "Daddy," she murmured, half asleep, "did you know Miss Ashford makes the hall lights less scary?" James looked at her with softened surprise. "Does she now?" Viola nodded solemnly. "They don't hum as loud when she's here." Eileen blinked, startled by the child's certainty. Then she knelt and pulled the girl gently into her arms. Viola melted against her like she had belonged there always. Eileen pressed her cheek against the crown of her hair, something in her chest breaking and mending all at once. Later, when James carried Viola to bed, Eileen lingered at the doorway, watching the way he tucked the blanket beneath her chin, the way he kissed her brow with a tenderness so fierce it almost hurt to see. When he turned and found her there, she didn't look away. "You do that like breathing," she whispered. His expression softened, a quiet shrug. "It's all I've ever known how to do." Spring came. The city thawed, trees lining the avenues unfurling new green. Eileen's penthouse balcony filled with plants she had never cared for before, yet somehow kept alive with Viola's help. Small pots of herbs, a tomato vine stubbornly climbing toward light. James teased her about it once, and she surprised him with laughter, low, unguarded, the sound of a woman remembering herself. One evening, the 3 of them sat outside together. Viola dozed on a blanket with a stuffed rabbit tucked against her. The city light stretched vast, but for once did not feel cold. James leaned on the railing, arms folded, his gaze on the horizon. Eileen stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on the cool metal. For a while, they said nothing. Then, softly, she asked, "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" He considered. "Sometimes. But if they had, I wouldn't be here. Neither would she." He nodded toward Viola. Eileen's throat tightened. And me? He turned his head, studying her in the dim light. And you? Her breath caught. She looked away, down at her hands. Silence stretched, thick with everything unspoken. Then James reached across the space between them and laid his hand gently over hers. Not forceful, not a demand, just a steady weight, grounding. Eileen closed her eyes, let her fingers curl into his. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a promise. It was something older, simpler, the recognition of belonging. That night, after Viola was asleep, James found himself standing at the balcony again, the city lights blinking like patient stars. Eileen joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She didn't stand apart. She stood beside him, close enough their arms brushed. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "if second chances come to those who least expect them?" James exhaled, long and quiet. "I stopped wondering. Now I just live in them." She turned then, studied the lines of his face, the scar, the eyes that held storms and silences alike. For once, she didn't guard her heart. She lifted a hand and touched his cheek tentative, as if she feared he would step back. He didn't. The city fell away. The years of betrayal, the walls she had built, the solitude he had carried, all of it bent toward this single, fragile moment. When he leaned down, their lips met not with hunger but with reverence, the kind of kiss born from wounds that had learned to heal in the presence of another. It was brief. It was enough. Inside, Viola stirred in her sleep. Eileen pulled back, resting her forehead against James's. "She's safe," she whispered, as if reminding herself. "She always will be," he answered. For a long while, they simply stood like that, hands joined, breath steady. Found family, second chances, redemption. Not in grand gestures, but in the quiet accumulation of trust. And for the first time in years, Eileen Ashford no longer felt alone. Because the Whitakers weren't alone anymore either. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to subscribe or share where you're watching from. These stories are about second chances, found family, and the quiet kindness that still exists in this world. And if you carry even a piece of that with you tonight, then the story has done its work.